go.
So wait just a couple seconds. There we go. All right. Hey,
Okay.
everybody. Welcome back to Treble with Missy and Thor. And this
Hi.
is our weekly music podcast that we do every week. And that sentence was totally redundant because I said weekly and then I said every week, which is like the same thing. So
Yes, it is.
this is when I haven't had enough coffee, but I'll have more coffee and I won't sound as redundant when I have more
Well, the
coffee.
good news is you're not teaching an English class right now, so that's
Well,
good.
even when I do, it's the same thing that I'm doing
It's
here. So
the same thing.
anyway, but welcome back, everybody. And we have a
Yes.
really great show for you tonight. And Missy is going to say a few things about Apollo Piano, which is the
Yes.
gallery where we are right here.
We're
So,
at Apollo
yeah.
Music Arts here in Chico, California. Stop on by whenever you can. They have a showroom of pianos. So this is so not our living room. This is just a great our living room. We're not, no, we live in separate
One day
rooms.
it'll be my living
One
room.
day. But yeah, there's a lot of pianos here, great pianos, Yamahas. And so if you have a chance, stop on by. They also have other instruments. As you can see to our right and left, we have guitars too. And they have all sorts of music lessons here. So um, come on by. They're here on
Yes.
Mangrove in Chico, California. And thank you, Vince Chambers, owner of Apollo Piano, for facilitating this podcast for us.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And plus, it's just a very kind of a relaxed environment, and the staff here is really nice.
Yes.
They're very welcoming.
Yes.
Um, they're not like snobbish. Like, they're not going to like snub you when you walk in. They're not going to be like, "Psh, who are you?" They're actually going to be like, hey, what's your name and what can we do to help you? And
Exactly.
do you want to play one of our pianos? So
Yes.
yeah, pretty cool place. So
Yes, it's awesome.
yeah. So all right. So we have a really exciting show because this is actually definitely Missy knows this already. This is one of my favorite topics,
It is.
and it's the topic of the art of music composition. And as many of you know, I am a composer, and I have. I'm sorry, that's my computer. Wait a second. My Twitter just opened up. I'm so popular, right? So yeah. No, but it's one of my favorite topics because when I first started composing, I was about 10 years old. That was when I first started making up melodies. And I had already been playing the violin for several years. I'd already been training on that instrument, and I'd already been playing the piano, kind of self, kind of self-taught. Hang on a second here. Let me turn the sound off. I'm really only doing this to look like I'm being fancy because I have a laptop on here, but
Missy is.
it really just sits there. It's just for show. And just so just so you guys know, I printed out some very official printed out notes. That's very it's just a
It's
scrap of
copious
paper,
notes.
like copious notes. Yeah.
Yes.
So we're talking about music composition today, and I'm going to just say a few things about my background with composing, and maybe give some tips and advice for anybody who might be interested in pursuing that as either a hobby or just a craft as like a hobby, or even something more serious if that's
Hmm.
something if you want to get into songwriting. And Melissa tonight is going to share some things from a book she read about Debussy, who was a very famous composer. So
Hmm.
and I didn't even find this out until tonight. See, this is how spontaneous we are.
Absolutely.
And this plant is still not centered. So okay, so
So yeah, go
yeah,
get started because you have
okay.
a lot of things here.
I have a few things. Yeah. So
Yes.
basically, if you take it, it could be any instrument because you could compose on a guitar. Also, you could write guitar songs, for example, and a lot of people do. Um, Traditionally, if you take piano lessons, the way that it usually works is that you're given sheet music and you're told these are the notes. This is the way the composer wrote the notes. So therefore, this is how you play them. And you could get into things like, well, why did the composer write it this way? Why didn't he write the song in G flat? Why didn't he do this? Why did he choose to use legato in this passage? Why did they use, you can ask those kind of like music appreciation questions, but you usually don't get there until you're well into like third or fourth or fifth year even of piano lessons. The first
Hmm.
few years is just like, this is the note, this is right, this is wrong,
Hmm.
you know. So so if you take piano lessons, that's kind of what that is. If you take composition lessons, that's a whole other dimension
Hmm.
of learning. And that's sometimes where I come in because I do teach traditional piano lessons to kids who are whatever 6 years old, and I just teach the notes, and I don't force any of my composition knowledge on them. I just say, this is how you learn to play the piano. These are the basics. So I'm very good about that.
Yeah, it just starts with Yankee Doodle Dandy.
I do. I start with Yankee Doodle Dandy. If you can get past that, you're good to go, right? Yeah. It's funny how that's like a recurring theme here. Yeah. So Yankee Doodle Dandy. But I also teach composition classes on the piano. So what that means is that right now I have, I think, 5 students that are composition students, and they already know how to play the piano, but they want to know how to write their own music. So there is a little bit of a prerequisite. You kind of have to know some things about the piano before
Yes.
you learn how to write on the piano. So that's kind of a given.
Hmm.
So if you already play a little bit, even if you're sort of a beginner and you're just getting started, you can
Hmm.
take composition classes with me, and I can teach you the craft. And I think the one of the questions that people come up with is, how do so I'm looking at my notes just so you know, I'm like
Hmm.
not ignoring you, I'm like looking
Hmm.
over here. How do people no um so when you have like a composer that writes a song, how does a composer start with just absolute silence and come up with a song out of thin air?
Hmm.
And this is the question that I get the most. And people just seem so baffled. They're like, how do you do that? Like, how do you just come up with what? Do you just like randomly push a bunch of notes and what sounds good, that's what you're going to use? Or do you hear it in your head first? Um, so I get that question a lot. And my response to that is, if you want to learn how to write music, you need just a very rudimentary, rudimentary, is that the right word? And I'm an English teacher.
I
Oh my God.
know.
Rudimentary, Terry, and a very basic knowledge of music theory, just a little bit of music theory, and a very basic knowledge of the piano. So you don't have to get to the point where you're like super proficient, like Missy is. She's had years and years of training, and but just have a very basic knowledge. And what that means is that what you would start out with is, first of all, know the names of the notes.
Mhm.
And I know you think there's 88 notes, but there's not. There's only 7,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
Because there's A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and then it goes back up to A again and it just cycles back.
Hmm.
You only have to know 7 notes to know all the notes in the piano. There's a pattern. So if you don't know that, now you know.
Yeah,
And
sharps go to the right, flats
yeah,
go to the left with the
exactly. So
key.
you just learn the basics. Exactly. Yeah. Sharps go to the right. Yeah, exactly. So
Yes.
you learn that. And then after you learn that, you learn a set of chords. Now, by definition, I know I'm getting kind of technical here. By definition, a chord is anytime you play 3 or more notes together at the same time.
Mhm.
Has to be 3 more. If it's only 2, that's not a chord. That's not a chord. That's called an interval. And so you can imagine, with all the combination of keys there are many different chords. So again, chords is 3 or more notes played together. So you have C major, you have C minor, you have D major, D minor, and you have the major and minor chords,
Mhm.
which if you take just the major chords, there's technically 12, right? And
Mhm.
then you have the minor chords, and I up to 24, So you basically learn the basic chords, and you don't have to really learn the fancy ones yet, like the
Yes.
sevenths and the ninths, and like the diminished and suspendeds, and the all those. Although that would be very helpful, but just have a very basic knowledge of the piano, and that might take you maybe 6 months.
Mhm.
Like if you're an adult, you could cram that into 6 months and learn the basics very quickly, and then you can start to learn composition. So really,
Exactly.
6 months to a year of basic training. I know that sounds like a military term, but that's not what I'm talking
Yes.
about. It's and I won't be a sergeant. Don't worry. I'm not going to
Yes.
be making you do push-ups. But so that's what you would do, and then you start training in composition. Okay, and here's what that entails, because I'm going back to this question of like, well, how do you just come up with a melody out of thin air? And here's how you do that. There's kind of 2 parts to every song, and obviously there's exceptions, because
Mhm.
there are composers that will say, well, I don't do it this way. But a lot of music and a lot of songs have 2 parts, and one part is called a melody. So what does
That is
melody
right.
mean? I know I'm kind of taking
It's
over
like
the
the
yeah.
singing part of
Yeah,
the piece.
exactly.
Yes.
It's the part that you would hum to.
Yes.
And usually, oftentimes, it's one note at a time, not always, but it's kind of like the part that you would sing to, like on the
Mhm.
radio, is the part that
Mhm.
is sung in like popular songs. And
Mhm.
on the piano, it's often played with a right hand. Not always, but often. Okay.
Yes.
That's the melody. The other part is called what? I'm
The
quizzing you.
accompaniment.
Yes, or the harmony.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
harmony.
The
Yes.
accompaniment or the harmony. That's like the background. Those are the chords usually.
Mhm.
usually the harmony is played with chords. So you have two parts, melody and harmony. So this is kind of the basic foundation that you would learn first thing on day one of
Hmm.
your composition course. You learn there's
Yes.
two parts, right? Um, when it comes to writing a melody, it is exactly what I mentioned before. You just try different things with the notes, and when something sounds good and it kind of sticks out, you say, that sounded good that I just played just a second ago. Maybe I'll keep that. And you write what are called phrases, and you learn what are called cadences. And your first assignment, which you have still yet to do, by the way,
I can do it.
you can do it. That was only a few
A
months later.
musical sentence. So you're
Yes,
basically telling a story when you're writing a
you
song.
are. Yeah,
A musical story.
exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
And so they have what are called phrases, and you learn about how to create phrases in your melody when
Yes.
you learn composition. And again, the reason, one of the reasons I know a lot of this stuff is not is I mean, I've researched it obviously, but also I've been doing this since I was 10. So for me, it's very intuitive. It's very natural,
Hmm.
because if you've been doing anything since you were 10, it's going to come very naturally to you. So there's a lot that I can offer in terms of saying, oh, okay,
Hmm.
that's very effective. That phrase
Hmm.
that you just used, that one won't work very well because A, B, and C. And I can kind of
Yes.
tell you that just right off the bat,
Yes.
because I've been doing this a long time, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of what I offer as far as a composition course. And then I'll mention a couple things because we're almost
Because
to
at the end of
yeah.
those phrases too, there
Mhm.
you have to punctuate.
Yeah.
So, you know, whenever you have a musical sentence, it's like you're speaking a sentence. And
Mhm.
so you want to make sure that your song isn't like a run-on sentence.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you take composition,
Mhm.
blah blah blah.
You're
What's
just
our?
like me.
We can't talk today.
It's
Um,
7:30 at night. We can't talk,
at the we do have coffee. But still, we're still waking up, I guess, from the day. I don't know, waking up again. But anyway,
Yep.
so yeah, you will need that punctuation throughout the song.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because there's people always ask, well, how do you just come up with a melody? And what I would do is I would assign you, the
Hmm.
student, to come up with a simple phrase or a simple melody by next week. And you just go home and come up with that. And the main roadblock that most students think they have, it's not a real roadblock because you can easily get over it. And the roadblock they
Yes.
think, it's a mental roadblock, is they think
Hmm.
they have to come up with something brilliant on
Hmm.
week number one. And
Hmm.
you don't. Just come up with three notes. Doon doon doon. That's your melody,
Hmm.
It can be it could be a three-note phrase. It could
Hmm.
be a four-note phrase.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be Mozart or something, or
and
Debussy,
and it,
or
it usually really helps to have a foundation. So if you can
Mhm,
take at least a year of piano before
mhm.
you dive into composition, it will help you a
Yeah,
lot,
it will.
because there are some, I think, some music foundations that need to be kind of established before you can go in that. But that's the cool thing about what you do, Thor, is that
Mhm.
you do offer that um,
Yeah.
musical, like that music education on top of
Mhm.
what you're doing there with composition.
Yeah, and I've done both, and I've had situations, for example, where somebody, there's kinda 3 or 4 different scenarios. One scenario is, there are students, obviously, that have this American Idol syndrome where they think they're just gonna take a class with me, and within 3 months, they're gonna be famous. I have had young students who, I mean, where I kinda had to give them a wake-up call. But, with that, I just say, yeah, it takes a lot of work, doesn't it? Because they still have to do that
Hmm.
6 months to a year of
Hmm.
training before they start composing.
Yes.
And they get uncomfortable on week 2 because they have to learn scales. They're like, "I don't wanna do this." Like,
Yeah, and that's
you
even
know
like with a lot of like professional singers too. A lot of
Yeah.
singers that you see have had a lot of training. It takes a lot of discipline.
Yeah.
And I know like Mariah Carey, for example, her mom was an opera singer, a professional opera singer. So,
Mhm.
you know, there is I think a certain amount of discipline that you have to do any art,
Yeah,
really.
yeah, any kind of
Yes.
a craft, especially when you
Yes.
talk about, like, quality,
Mhm.
things like that. So, here's another example because,
Mhm.
I talked about, like, okay, your first homework assignment, you go home, you come up with a melody, simple melody, and come back to me next week, and we'll work on it. That would be your first assignment. And remember, it doesn't have to be great. So the equivalent, like, the
Mhm.
analogy of that is if you're a filmmaker, so pretend you're a filmmaker, right? Maybe you are. Some of you actually have friends who are. So if you're a filmmaker and you're just starting out, is your first film going to be a blockbuster hit? Probably
Probably
not.
not.
Probably
Yeah.
not. But that's part of the learning process. You learn, you make a couple of crappy films, and right?
Yeah.
But you publish them and you say this is a film by Melissa Brown, whatever, right?
Mhm.
And that's your debut film. And then you learn from that and you get better at it
Mhm.
because you learn from your experience and you're like, okay, this time I'm going to use a different zoom lens or something,
That's true. I mean, if
you know?
we look back at our first recitals, Thor,
Yeah.
I don't think I
Or our
don't
first
think there would
podcast.
be like standing ovations for those. But yeah,
Well, there'll be standing ovations when they want to leave. No, just
yes.
kidding. So, yeah, but it's the same thing with writing music. Your first, people. There's too many people that expect that their first song has to be like a hit that's going to make them famous. That's not going to happen. I mean, that's
Yeah,
not an insult, but you need to start somewhere.
exactly.
If you learn to go skiing for the first time, you're going to fall on your butt a couple times, but you have to learn to get on those skis. So when you write your first melody, it might not be anything
Hmm.
super super spectacular, but
Yes.
at least it's something. And then when you come to me, I'm not going to criticize you. I'm not going to be like, oh, that's terrible. I'm like, okay,
Yes.
let's see what we can do with this. It's interesting that you played an F sharp after a C natural because usually people wouldn't do that, but let's see what we can do with it
Exactly.
because that's a very dissonant interval. But.
So can I want to
Yes,
I want to share
go
something
for
real
it.
quick.
Mhm.
Okay, so what I wanted to share with our audience here is well, not just about this artist here, but in general. Let's talk about inspiration. I know even like with my students, I've had students who have composed, who have written music. One in particular, his first piece, believe it or not, and this piece and this student, mind you, was he had done some National Piano Teacher Guild auditions and so forth, so he had a good knowledge of key signatures and time signatures and whatnot. His first piece was in the key of C sharp minor,
Ouch. Wow.
and
Okay.
it was good. And I remember, I don't know if you remember our guest speaker, April Taylor, but I had submitted this composition to her mom.
Wow.
And she
Okay.
said, Melissa, did you help him with this? I said, no.
Hmm.
He made this up himself. And one of his biggest inspirations was Beethoven.
Hmm. He is a big inspiration to a lot of people.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he picked that particular key signature from the
Hmm.
Moonlight Sonata.
Oh yeah. Well, that's a good
Yeah,
example.
see?
Yeah.
So and then same thing with Claude here. He, he had a lot of inspiration. Chopin was one of them.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
you'll notice too, like in the music, you'll find that the large hand positions
mhm.
are very similar.
Large hand position. What do you
Yeah,
mean?
large hand positions mean there's a lot of like maybe eighths or ninths
Oh wow.
intervals
Yeah.
in
Okay.
the songs. Same thing like with Beethoven, he had some large hand positions, even though some of them were small, but most of them were large. Chopin and Beethoven, you could tell the guys that had the big hands and the small hands. Bach,
And Rachmaninoff too.
small.
His
Well,
hands were like this
Rachmaninoff
big.
was big. Bach was small.
Yeah.
Mozart was small. Chopin was big. Rachmaninoff was big.
It's interesting that
Large.
you take a note of that. That's
I
the
have to.
size
I
of our
have
hands.
small
You have
hands.
small hands.
So when I was studying
Yeah.
at the university with Dr. Baudet, she had very small hands too, and she was French,
Mm.
and so she would help me kind of transpose some of those large hand positions that we could not do,
Yeah.
and
Mm.
change them to the small hands.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
very sensitive to that, Thor.
Yeah, yeah. But it's good that you were able to find a way to work around that.
Yes,
I know I know the plight that you're referring to, this
yes,
struggle, because there are kids who have very small hands when they're 5 years old.
yes,
How do they play? And if they get to the point where they're supposed to be able to play an octave,
yeah.
they can only reach halfway. They can only reach a
Exactly.
fifth.
And that's
But
what
there's
I really that's I mean, I think it's great that small children that, can play very well on the piano, but I'm kind of opposed to it in a way too. Because I feel like when they're so young and they're playing songs, especially when their hands are smaller than mine, they do not execute the phrasing correctly.
mhm,
And so I really try to encourage my students who are, at an age where I think it's appropriate for them to play those music, maybe with the large hand positions.
mhm,
They're at least able to attempt it or try it, and able to execute the phrasing correctly. To to maybe not watch those videos, to maybe watch them of more performers that maybe are more of an age where those phrases can be played appropriately.
Yeah. Are you talking about
So instead of
so what?
watching
Yeah.
a 4-year old play a song,
Uh,
maybe watching someone who maybe is in their, like an accomplished pianist on the
yeah.
piano who is able to play through those phrases correctly. She has to be
Mhm.
really careful. And I think that's the one, I think that can be a mistake where the small children, the really, really small children are playing songs that might, like I said, they're not, there's this phrasing that can be, or that could be misinterpreted
Yeah.
because they're not executing them
Well,
correctly.
well, and here's the thing, because we're on YouTube right now, and this
Yes.
is a very popular platform. I don't know if you noticed. There's millions and billions of people that use it.
Yes.
So I hear this a lot. Well, I saw a video on YouTube on how to play this.
Yes.
Anybody can put a video on you. How do you know he's good? He could be terrible.
Yeah.
So as an example, there's one of my favorite Bach pieces is the Gavotte in G minor, which
Mm.
I'm actually going to be recording and putting on my YouTube, by the way. Because I just really like that song. It's very haunting.
Yes.
And I taught it to one of my students who's 13, and she played it a certain way, and it was very it didn't have any emotion to it because she didn't use the right dynamics. If you know what that means, it has to do with the crescendos and different things like that.
Diminuendos, the
Yeah,
softs and the louds.
exactly. And she wasn't doing that at all. And she also didn't do the repeat in the beginning of the piece. There's a repeat. And I'm like, and she's a really, really good student. Normally she nails it. So I'm like, what are you doing? You're totally
Yes.
doing this differently. I
Hmm.
didn't say it was wrong, but I was like, I know you can do better than that. And
Hmm.
she's like, well, that's how the guy played it on YouTube. And so they think YouTube is like this official source. No, it could be anybody. It could be some dork that's never played in his life. That's gonna. So make sure if you do a YouTube search, do a little bit of research and be like, okay, there's somebody named Melissa Brown. Is
Yeah.
Melissa Brown any good?
and
Then
and it's
research it.
also very good, maybe if you do have the music in front of you, to follow the musician on YouTube with the music, so you can see if they
Yeah.
are or playing the song appropriately.
Yeah, and see if it's an actual professional pianist too,
Yes.
because if it's just a kid that's playing in his apartment or something, it could be just a kid that could be playing it very differently than the way it's supposed to.
Hmm.
And so just do your research a little bit. And
Hmm.
most people kind of realize this, but some people put a little bit too much stock in it. Well, it's YouTube, therefore, just
Yes.
because it's on the internet doesn't mean that it's the best source, right?
Yes.
So yeah.
So can I want to go back to
Absolutely. Yeah.
this composer real quick. So Debussy also was inspired by painting and by poetry. And I always found his music so fascinating
Hmm. Yeah.
because there is it's called it is like the song is like it's like you're painting a picture. It's very,
Mhm.
very beautiful. Everybody knows Claire de Lune, so I'll
Yes.
just use that
Yeah.
as an example.
Well, everybody knows it. Not everyone knows the title.
Oh,
But when
that's
they hear
true.
it, they're like,
When
I
you
know
hear
this
it,
song.
it's be
Yeah.
like, oh, I know that song.
Same with for Elise.
Yes.
Like,
Oh
I've
no,
never heard
I
of
had
that
to
song.
ban that from a recital one year. I had like 6 girls say, I want to play for Elise. I'm
They're
like,
like,
that's
nope.
it.
Yep.
I have to
Whoever
ban the
pays me the
song.
most money can.
Yes. We're playing something else.
Yeah.
But anyways, yeah, so like I said, it goes back to inspiration. Go back to the musicians who inspire you and kind of draw from that. There's if poetry or if painting, it really does help you when you are trying to write a piece and you're trying to make it personal. You have to bring the emotion, you have to bring everything that's about you to it. It's like music, it's
Yeah.
about, where you said musical interpretation, and some of the students use that against you, Thor.
Yeah, they do.
um
That's my interpretation. No, it's not. Yeah, I know. I know
but
what you mean.
yes, I just wanted to just throw that out there. So because we don't have a whole lot of time, so
That's
but
okay.
I just wanted
Yeah.
to share that with everybody, because and I always tell my students, when you're playing a song, you have like this, it's like a piece of, you have a canvas basically,
Yeah.
and you're
Exactly.
throwing in the dynamics, when you're throwing in there all that articulation, the staccatos, the
Mm.
legatos,
Yeah.
the accents in
Mm.
those
Crescendos and
phrases.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, you start to bring color. So what I like to do, Thor, is like, okay, the dynamics, The diminuendos, those represent pink. The
Hmm.
crescendos
Like different
represent
colors.
blue.
Yeah.
Yeah, different
Yeah.
colors. And so, okay, how many colors are you adding to your canvas?
And these
And
are
it's
all
very
artistic
interesting.
choices too, you know.
Yes.
So, do you mind if I piggyback
Yeah,
off
go
that? Is
for
that,
it.
yeah, because I think in very much the same way, and it is very
Yeah,
much the same way. Um, if you're so remember I said that there's two types, there's two parts to every song. There's a melody and
a harmony.
yes, very good.
I
You get an A plus. So there's a melody and
I'm
a
so
harmony.
glad I remembered.
You're like, oh, thank God.
I passed the
I didn't
test.
fail his class. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's a melody and a harmony. Now, harmony is usually consist of chords, usually, or either they're different notes, but they make up chords. So that's called an arpeggio, but we'll get into that later. And the way I think of it is you're going to come up with what's called a chord progression in your composition, which means
Mhm.
you play one chord, often with the left hand, not always, but it's the harmony. You play one chord, and then you play another chord, and then you play a
Yes.
third chord, and then you play another one, and then maybe you repeat that cycle. So let's say the first chord is C major. Let's say
Hmm.
the second one is A minor.
Hmm.
Those go very well together. Then maybe another one is F, and then you
Hmm.
play a more interesting. Maybe you play a B flat.
Hmm.
So you pick like three or four chords, and you write the melody over that. So you mentioned painting. So here's what I want to kind of say about that. The melody. So if you think about a painting, let's say there's a painting of a woman standing in a field, something
Okay.
very basic, like a Monet or something.
Okay.
The woman standing in the field is the subject of the painting, right?
Yes.
She is like the melody. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
the melody is supposed to stand out a little bit. That's what you hum to. That's what you hear.
Hmm.
That's what the lyrics would be. That's what the lyrics would be if there were lyrics.
That's right.
Um, the field in the background of the painting is like the harmony. It supports the melody, right? It supports the subject. That's
Yes.
the way. So you need to think in terms of paintings or art when you write a song. You need to think in those terms.
Exactly.
um, Melissa mentioned that there's like a proverbial canvas when
Hmm.
you're writing music.
That's right.
Silence is your canvas, and you're filling that canvas. I know this is very cheesy, and I'm using these analogies, but it really helps you to get in that right frame of
It
mind when
does.
you're writing songs.
Hmm.
Silence is a canvas, and you want to fill the canvas with paint, and the paint is the different notes you use. And the what's interesting about the chord progressions is you can pick different chords progressions, and some of them there's no right or wrong when it comes to the order of the chords that you use.
That's
You can
right.
use there's hundreds of chords you can use, right? There's no right or wrong, but what I will tell you, there's different combinations that will create a different mood.
That's right.
So minor chords will sound sad. This is very basic. Major chords will sound happy. Diminished chords will sound very tense,
Hmm.
for example.
Yes.
And I think I know you know what I'm talking, because you know what these things are and you've
Yes.
played them, right? And
Yeah, like so diminished, like a diminished chord, for example, have a lot of conflict.
mhm,
You could play the notes, and they
dissonance.
just they
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. And you think of that as like your colors when you paint.
Hmm.
And you can paint anything you want. Just pretend you're like a 6-year-old kid with a bunch of crayons. You're going to paint whatever you want. You come up with a composition.
Yes.
Don't worry. You're not going to become famous from your first composition. Okay.
Well,
Just
you might,
you
but
might, but just come up with something. Don't think about the result. Don't be like, this has to be a masterpiece. Just come up with something. Right.
hmm
Um, it's kind of like when you were a kid and you made a crayon painting and you showed it to your mom. Just do that, but with me, and then I'll put it on the refrigerator.
yes,
So, anyway, that's kind of the idea. And I know we're out of time here, but we're going to go more into this next week, because
yes,
if you don't mind, I want to do part two. Is that okay?
yes, that'd
Yeah.
be wonderful. Can I add something just
Yes.
real
Add
fast?
something, please. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the melody and the harmony. Okay, so I like to tell my students voicing is extremely important. And sometimes if you play the harmony too loud, it can actually distort the melody line.
Yeah.
And so it's really important that when you're playing a piece or you're making it up, to try to make sure that singing part is played louder than the
Yeah.
accompaniment or harmony part.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's that same analogy with a painting, so that when you look at a painting of a woman standing in the field, their eyes are usually directed to the woman, which
Hmm.
is the subject. And then later on, when you look at the painting for a while, you look at the shrubs in the background or whatever.
Hmm.
It's the same kind of thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So yeah, so it's there is a method to the madness, as I said in my
There is.
recent Facebook post, and I'll give you one example of real quick, because I know we gotta end here, but
Yes.
so if you play a C major followed by a G major. Now, if you don't know what these are because you've never played music, it's fine. Just humor me for a second. So, if you play a C major followed by a G major, it's going to sound very nice and hunky dory. It's kind of boring, but it's a nice start, right? If you play a C major followed by a G suspended 4, again, if you don't know what that is, that's fine. It's going to sound a lot more interesting and it's going to have a very suspenseful feel to it. That's why it's called a suspended chord. So you can create different moods. And what I ask my composition students to do is make a list. Okay. So make a
Mhm.
list of different chord progressions and write down the feeling that you get when you play it. And then you are armed with all these different tools of what you can use. You have all these colors in your paint thing. I don't know what that's called, not the canvas, but the thing that you have the paints.
The palette.
Yeah, the palette. Thank you. So you have more colors in your palette, right?
It's getting late.
It's getting late. I know I'm losing my edge, right? So, but that's the analogy, and you just paint with the notes, so to speak. And when I say go home and come up with a melody, just come up with anything.
Mhm.
Anything doesn't have to be great,
Yes,
and then we can work on making it great.
exactly.
And same with the chords and the chords. So if you play, here's a really cool one because you can try this at home. If you understand chords and you have a piano at home, try this. You play for example, a C major, and then A flat C major and A flat major, or no, even better, a C major and an F minor. If you do something like that, I don't know if you can hear that in your head. I can tell you're trying
A
to.
C major and an F minor chord.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's going to sound very mystical, like a sci-fi film.
Yes.
So when you do something, you can create different moods, and that's what you use to create. So if you want to write a song about the stars in space, where the other places where there's stars, but except us two, right? But if you want to write, a song about the Milky Way, you would use something that sounds very mystical and like a sci-fi movie, right?
Yes.
So you would choose that chord progression because that's one of the paints that you have. So that's the analogy. So I would say just kind of think on that
Mhm.
over the week, and then we're going to get more into this next week because there's so much more we can
Yes.
discuss.
So
And
we're going to be
yeah.
talking about more composition, music composition next week.
Mm.
But the week after, I have an announcement.
She has a very big announcement.
We are going to have a very fabulous guest speaker. His name is Nolan Shahid. He is a jazz musician and he's from LA and he's worked with some of the greats, and I mean legendary greats, Diana Ross, uh, Phil Collins, and
Yeah.
he was a former manager of Marvin Gaye. So, hey,
Yeah.
we are very excited. I can't even tell you how excited we are.
She's been talking about this for the last 2 days. So,
Yes.
and I'm really excited too because this is somebody that is very prominent in the music industry. So we're really excited because it's making us look good, and we're just like, oh my god, it's an actual person. And
I would have him come on next week, but he's got a recording session at his house. So, we didn't want to
yeah,
interfere with
well,
that.
and it's fine. We're just grateful that we can actually borrow his time and that he's gonna,
Yes, we are
and it'll be
so
probably over
honored.
the speakerphone again, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so not next week, but the week after. But go and watch next week too because
Yes,
you don't have anything better to
absolutely.
do on Thursday. So
Exactly. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about Nolan Shahid, and I was able to
yeah,
talk to him on the phone today, and I can't tell you what a wonderful, fabulous musician he is. I'm really,
yeah,
really excited to have him
it'd
on our
be really
show.
cool. And
Yeah.
we're just gonna let him talk.
Oh
Which
yeah,
means
you
so
just get to hear him.
you
I
get a
mean, it's
break from us and just hear this professional jazz musician who has been in the industry longer than I have probably. And yeah, I think
yeah,
it's really
it's
exciting.
really really nice too. And then maybe next week we could talk a little bit about jazz music
Sure. Yeah.
as well,
Okay.
to kind of educate our
Yeah.
viewers here a little bit about
Yeah.
the background on jazz music a little
Actually,
bit.
there's a very notable professor, or yeah, he's a professor who plays a saxophone, and I think he's at Chico State.
Hmm.
And I can't recall his name because he has a really long last name.
Hmm.
But I'll find out and I can
Yes.
mention. So I'll
Yes,
recommend. Yeah.
yes, but we're gonna mention a little bit about that genre next week. So we kind of tie into the following, but we're super
Mhm.
excited. Thank you so much for
Thank
tuning in.
you.
Please subscribe, and we will see you next Thursday at 7:30.
7:30. Okay.
Yes.
Am I doing the honors?
Yes, you can
Okay.
do the honors. Thank you, everybody,
I'll try not to
and have
trip
a
on the
good
way.
night. And Thor, don't fall.
I was so close.
Good night.